Hi, I'm Donald Davidson. I'm the historian for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and this is part of the series called Stories with Donald. Dan Gurney drove in the 500 for the first time in 1962, and he was a Grand Prix driver by that time. He was a sports car guy who had gone to Europe and driven for Ferrari, BRM, and Porsche, and he very much knew about the Indianapolis 500, but he'd never been to the track, apparently, until he drove in 1962. And he was going to drive a rear-engine turbine-powered car for John Zink of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and so he showed up. They didn't want to use the turbine for his rookie test, which he had to take. Although he was a Grand Prix driver, he still had to take the rookie test, and so he took it in an Offenhauser-powered roadster, and then tried to work the turbine up to speed. And they realized early on in the month that it wasn't a very good combination, and so they withdrew the turbine just a couple of days before the first qualifying day, and then Mickey Thompson said, "Would you like to drive one of my cars?" And he had 3 rear-engine cars that were powered by V8 Buicks. And so Dan went ahead, and on the first qualifying day, he qualified 8th. And then, as with he was sort of one of the first of the Grand Prix drivers that came while still active in Grand Prix. And because the 500 lasted for a month, they were pretty busy going back and forth across the Atlantic, because they would come and practice here, and then they would go to Europe for an event, come back, qualify, leave again, and back and forth and back and forth. So the 500 in those days was May the 30th, regardless of the day of the week on which it held. And so if it was Tuesday or Thursday, that's Memorial Day, and that's when the 500 was held, except when it fell on Sunday, and then they would run the race on Monday, May the 31st. So I think the 500 in 1962 was probably Wednesday or Thursday, and on the Sunday was the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. And so Dan had driven at Monaco, and he qualified here and back and forth. So he goes over to Zandvoort for the Dutch Grand Prix, and he really had an eye-opener because of what he thought the potential was at the Speedway. He was driving a rear-engine car and had the only rear-engine car in the race. And the year before, Jack Brabham, who was the 2-time defending world champion from Australia, had driven a rear-engine Grand Prix Cooper in the Indianapolis 500 and finished 9th. And so Dan's looking around and thinking, the potential for a lightweight rear-engine car. Now, not everybody would be happy to hear this, me included, because I loved the front-engine roadsters, and I thought the rear-engine cars would change everything, but they had come in and become the way to go in Grand Prix racing. And Cooper, in spite of the fact that it won the World Championship in '59 and '60, was a little tiny operation from Surbiton, south of London, and they operated out of a garage. And I think there was probably 8 people work for them. It was a little tiny operation. And Dan was thinking, if Jack Brabham could come over and do what he did with that little tiny operation, what would it be if there was some real money behind such an effort? And so while he was in Zandvoort, he says to Colin Chapman, who was the founder and principal of Lotus, and Jim Clark was their #1 driver now. And so he went to Chapman and said, "You really ought to come, why don't you come back with me and watch the Indianapolis 500? Because you know, I think you could, your cars, if you built special cars for Indianapolis, I think you would do very well. Well, Chapman apparently wasn't very interested, and Dan convinced him and even paid bought his airfare. He said, just come with me and see this thing. So Dutch Grand Prix is Sunday, and then probably Monday or Tuesday they arrive at the Speedway and getting ready for the race. As I say, it was Wednesday or Thursday or whatever. So Chapman's looking around, and unfortunately wasn't very complimentary of our beloved roadsters, which, you know, we just loved. And he thought they were, you know, prehistoric monsters, and you know, you know, that they were living in the Dark Ages. Well, what Dan knew at the time was that, I don't know that it was generally known, but he knew that Ford Motor Company, who had been out of racing because all of the manufacturers in 1957 had all agreed to not support automobile racing, although it was a great way to sell cars, was a success on the track. Well, little side story, I think some of them were still helping, you know, discreetly, but they weren't officially in it. Well, that was about to end because Ford wanted to come in and be involved in racing and go to Le Mans and everything. And Dan knew that. Dan was on the inside. And so Chapman comes and is not terribly impressed with the cars that he was seeing and the technology at that time. But Dan knew about Ford wanted to come back in. So he arranged a meeting between Colin Chapman of Lotus and Ford Motor Company, and they made a deal. We'll do a team next year, which will be Ford backed. And so in the fall of 1962, Jim Clark came with a Grand Prix car to do exploratory laps and then learn what they could learn, and then go back and build cars for Indianapolis, which I mean, they were Grand Prix based, but with some, but